This is your call to action. Get prepared, America. Economy, survival, energy, disasters. This is USAPrepares.com. Informative radio, educational radio. Interact now by emailing instructor@USAPrepares.com or text at 434-390-7953. Class, please take your seats. Now, your instructor, Vincent Finelli.
Watch the greenbacks tumble.
This ought to be a great class. Everyone all set? Cocked? Locked? Your dial set correctly to USAPrepares.com. And we're broadcasting 2 hours daily from high atop the Missouri Ozark Mountains. Studio A. Information's on the website, and there's a link to your instructors at USAPrepares.com. Podcasts are free, and there are articles on the website you may want to consider reading. USAPrepares.com. Converging threats, confronted daily by your instructors. I'm Vincent Finelli. Alex is producing the broadcast in Minnesota, and today's class is about the modern musket, the AR-15. And we're going to spend the next 2 hours building one. In-depth discussion about the components, the parts, the costs, the trade-offs. And when we're finished, you should have enough information to make the choices, to select the components, to build your own AR-15. Or, if you choose not to build your own, you'll have enough information to purchase the correct AR-15 and avoid wasting money. With us today is our senior USAPrepares.com firearms instructor, certified M16 and AR-15 armorer, Jeffrey Ohms. Jeff Ohms, welcome.
Morning, Vince. It's a great day to live in rural Missouri.
It really is. It really is a great day to live in rural Missouri. And Jeff, right next to me, in the studio, of course, is my AR-15. But that's not unusual. It's always right there. And I have a plain Jane AR-15, and as we discuss the components of an AR-15 and build one, maybe I'll see some modifications I should make to it, but maybe I won't. So let's go through that. Jeff, you've been to the Get Prepared Expo. You've been training our students in Springfield, Missouri for the concealed carry class. You're pretty well known here in the Springfield community. Let's talk about just what you do, and then we'll build the AR. Jeff, so what do you do on a daily basis?
Primarily, we basically embrace the AR and more or less military small arms platforms, but specifically to the accessory side of components, to the AR system, the quality aspect of that, and then of course we also do custom work for our customers that have something maybe similar to what you have, something simple that they want the right modifications without too many, of course, and that's always kind of sometimes people get carried away. So we counsel people on that, or we actually take it in and I will modify their system to enhance their shooting lifestyle. So that's basically what we do. We are an FFL SOT. For those who don't know, an SOT is a special occupational taxpayer, which means that we deal in full automatic firearms as well, along with the suppressors that can go on some of those for various uses and applications.
So, Jeff, if someone wanted to buy a suppressor, a silencer, as it may be called, for their firearm, they could buy one from you?
They could, especially Missouri being a very, very friendly state for suppressor ownership makes it easy. The only downside to it is the waiting time for the paperwork to clear from the NFA branch of the ATFE, which right now is anywhere between 6 and 9 months. They're that backed up. They only have 12 people processing these applications. Well, it might be 9 now. I think they lost a couple. So it takes forever. And they have to do this for all 50 states, not just Missouri. So it's just a waiting game. But in Missouri, you are fully within the law and you can have a suppressor. And a lot of guys take them out deer hunting, believe it or not.
Well, Jeff, should we take a couple minutes and talk about suppressors now, or do you want to talk about adding one onto an AR-15?
I think we can talk about that a little later when we get through the meat and potatoes of the discussion and discourse, and those are the periphery items, not the must-haves. The core, I think, is probably where our focus should be, because without that foundation and that solid core quality, anything else is basically your window dressing, a pig. So.
Okay. Well, let's do this. Then why don't we start with the lower receiver? Let's just, there's a lower receiver, an upper receiver, and then there's sights. So why don't we talk about the lower receiver first? And we've got 2 hours today to go through the complete discussion of building an AR-15. So, Jeff, what is a lower receiver?
Well, the lower receiver is technically the serialized part of the system that's actually considered the gun. Whether it has all the components installed or not, it's still handled and treated as a firearm. Some pistols are the same way. That being said, the lower receiver is also the core of the system. That's what supports everything else. So starting off with a quality lower receiver. Now, there's only about 3 companies in the country that actually make the rough castings for these lower receivers. After that, it goes to various machine shops to be turned into a finished lower receiver. There will be marks on that receiver. There's little, and you can look these up on online, but you'll see that there's Cardinal Forge, Anchor Harvey, and a couple of others that are primarily government contracts. But the lower receiver itself is made of an aluminum alloy. Typically what you want is the 7000 series alloy, and that's known as 7075-T6. That's an aircraft-grade aluminum alloy that is specifically heat-treated, and that's pretty important. There are others out there in the 6000 series. They will get the job done for a while, but they are not truly specified in military contract or even in commercial contract as being the best material available. So that lower receiver is the foundation. That's where the fire control parts go. The magazine release in the pistol grip, the buttstock, and all that will attach to that. Once that's completed or secured, that's where you start moving forward to the rest of the system. But that lower receiver is the important piece of the puzzle, as it were.
Okay, Jeff. So how do we know if we have a 7075 T6? Is it stamped, or do we have to rely on the manufacturer's brochure?
Well, typically the quality manufacturers are going to use that material primarily. There are some other possibilities, but we'll get into that in a minute. Typically, if you stay with well-known, established companies, Colt being one, of course, Stag Arms, LRB Arms, Tactical Machining, Spikes Tactical, Bravo Company, DPMS even, Bushmaster, most of those are using that alloy simply because the manufacturer of the casting or the raw part of that receiver, that's what they're going to use, because they have to fulfill quality contracts with the government, law enforcement, and the commercial side. So they're not going to cheap out. There are some smaller companies out there that may use a different material simply due to cost. One of them is a kind of notorious in the circles, but it's known as Hesse Arms, sometimes known as Blackthorn. It's pretty suspect at best. They're usually never crafted correctly in spec, so that there's a lot of problems with those. So if you avoid anything that says Blackthorn or Hesse, you'll probably be okay. But buying from a quality manufacturer, and you'll be fine. There's usually no issue, because they don't want the liability or the issues or tarnishing their good name. So that's what I tell people. I personally don't care whose name is on it. When I know that it comes from a quality manufacturer, it can say Donald Duck on it for all I care. As long as it's created correctly, the proper material, and it's machined into specification, it's going to work just fine. Some people will tell you that no, that's not true, but it is true. That's really where it boils down to.
Jeff Holmes, Are we talking about something analogous to if you buy a quality screwdriver from, let's say, Craftsman, you know that when you put it on the screw and you really have a tough time with the screw and you turn the screw, that the screwdriver tip won't bend as compared to an inexpensive, cheap screwdriver that will bend because the metal is so much weaker? Is that what we're talking about?
In essence, that's it. A good quality, yeah, like you said, a Craftsman or a Klein, I prefer Kleins, but that's just me, is certainly going to work day in and day out over and above something you get from Harbor Freight.
Maybe.
Yeah, a name does have some meaning in that respect. Now, there's also some out there, some other companies, again, they can buy these rough castings from anyone and have them machined to their specification. Aero Precision is another quality manufacturer. It's not a household name, but it's a quality manufacturer. As a matter of fact, they make for a lot of other, they private label for a lot of companies. So does Tactical Machine. They private label because there's not a lot of these machine shops that are set up to do nothing but this. And of course, that has a cost value and effectiveness. So if you're tooled up for it, nobody's going to make one or two of them and try and sell them and recoup their costs. It's simply not feasible. So if you're set up as a manufacturer of those items, 9 chances out of 10 you're gonna do it with a quality component added.
So, Jeff, we've got the lower receiver. Now, that's the part that you grab, you hold on to, you put your finger through the trigger guard. That is the part that you hold on to. But there are more components to the lower receiver. I mean, there are components to the lower receiver. It's the registered part. So when you want to buy one, let's say you want to build your AR-15, what is the legal process in order to purchase a lower receiver to build your AR-15?
It is no different than buying any other firearm. None. It is a firearm in and of itself, even though it's not completed. It is treated as a firearm. You would walk into your local shop, you would select the item out of the case, let's say, and the paperwork process would start. And in Missouri, at least, you would wait for the NICS check to come back, which only takes a couple minutes. You're good to go, and you pay the man, and you walk out the door with your stripped lower receiver, and it's a gun in anyone's eyes.
Even though you can't fire it, even though it's not complete, even though it doesn't have a barrel and so forth. Now, when you look in a gun store's case, or we'll come back to this in a second, but when you look at one of these things, it really looks intimidating because you've got to match the lower receiver with the upper receiver, and there's so many components and so many choices that you have. It's a little intimidating. So we're going to go through that. When we come back, we're going to talk about a little more about the lower receiver. We'll talk about the upper receiver that contains the barrel. We'll be right back. Jeff Holmes, and we're going to tell you how to get in touch. Class, Jeff Holmes is with us. Jeff OLMS is with us. He's our senior firearms instructor. And you can get in touch with him at MOA1911 at live.com. MOA1911 at live, LIVE.com. Jeff, we're talking about building an AR-15. We're doing it in depth today. Now, we talked about the lower receiver, and there's several components to the lower receiver. There's the butt stock, the buffer tube, triggers, trigger guards, pistol grips, and you can even get a whole kit. Why don't we take it from? Let's build it from the butt stock and so forth.
Okay, real quickly before we do it, we kind of got ahead of ourselves. I wanted to mention there's another type of lower receiver out there. There's two actually, but the one is known as a billet, which it's not a casting or a forging. They actually take a block of aluminum and they just CNC machine that out. They can be crafted into all kinds of unique configurations, and they're very interesting. There's some really good ones out there, and there's some really bad ones out there. The really good ones are going to cost an incredible amount of money, but they're made by very high-end companies. They are made out of a different alloy so that they can be heat treated correctly. The other thing out there that people will find are what's known as the polymer lower receivers. We have a big problem with those only because if you're going to make only a 22 long rifle type AR, that's fine. But if you're actually going to use a centerfire cartridge, these polymer lowers are highly suspect. They just don't have the service life or durability. They tend to crack. I think as plastics and those materials get better, there's probably going to be some traction in there, but at this point I would not suggest them. Yes, they're inexpensive, but again, you do get what you pay for. Along with that, moving back into the components of that lower receiver, this is what separates the men from the boys. This is what takes this system to the next level. And the good stuff doesn't really cost a whole lot more than the mediocre or the low end or run of the mill. Again, sticking with some of the very well-known names who've done nothing but research the system, and they have the mindset of first we look at the quality aspect, and then the price will follow, and that's true of a lot of things. Starting at the back end, when you say the buttstock, what the buttstock mounts to is now also known as a receiver extension. Some people will call it a buffer tube, but that receiver extension comes in two sizes: mil-spec or commercial. Some of the entry-level, or what we call hobby-type guns for the AR system, usually have a commercial buttstock tube, and that's okay, but you're limited sometimes to the type of stock you can attach. We prefer to use only the mil-spec size receiver extension / buffer tube. The ones we prefer are made by several companies. One of them is Viltor, V-L-T-O-R. Lewis Machine and Tool is another. Precision Reflex and Omega. All of those are incredibly high quality. The difference is you can buy a $20 receiver extension or buffer tube by a named maker. The problem with those typically is the alloy itself may not be correct. It may have too many impurities. It's not going to give you enough service life under rough usage. And the fact that they press the threads in as opposed to cut the threads in to where it actually attaches to the back of the receiver. Primarily, we use Viltors and LMTs. They're expensive. They're in that $50 range as opposed to $20. There's a reason for that. They simply are the best out there. Along with that, you now have a buffer spring and a buffer. That's what actually takes the recoil of the action in the cycling of the bolt. Again, we stick with the quality. We use very well-known makes. There's a couple of companies out there that make a superior quality buffer, and it may not, from outward appearances, it's hard to tell, but when you know that this manufacturer has gone to the lengths they have to craft this one little part, it doesn't seem like it does a lot, but it does everything. That makes all the difference. The springs we typically use are made by Colt for the buffer extension, or JP. JP Precision, JP Rifles makes a centerless ground stainless steel recoil buffer spring that is polished, and it is absolutely butter smooth and flawless. It actually can make it a little quieter for some folks. It's expensive. Again, a regular spring costs you $5, $6, $7, $8. These are around $20. There is value there, definitely.
Jeff Holmes is with us, and Jeff, when we come back, I'm looking at pictures of commercial versus mil-spec receiver and extensions. I'll tell you what, they look very, very similar, and we need to talk about how you can tell the difference. Jeff Holmes, Vin Finelli, USAPrepares.com. We'll be right back. We're building an AR-15 from the ground up. Class, in Northwest Houston, Texas, there are about 400 homes in this neighborhood. Last year, there were 107 home invasions. And there's a man who decided to do something about it. And he's giving away shotguns. He's giving away 12 or 20 gauge shotguns in a project called the Armed Citizen Project. So he's taking the lead in slowing down these home invasions by providing homeowners with 12 and 20 gauge shotguns. We're talking about building an AR-15, and we're at the buttstock, and Jeff Holmes is with us. Jeff, we talked about the commercial versus the military receiver and extension. I'm looking at a picture. Mine are military, but they look just like the commercial version. How would we tell if we were buying one at a dealer? We would ask them, obviously, but how would we know otherwise?
There's really not a lot of difference. There's a slight, like 0.02 of an inch difference externally. The threads are all the same that go into the back of the receiver. Those threads are all standard. But the difference is wall diameter of the mil-spec versus a commercial, and typically, but not always, but typically on a commercial receiver extension buffer tube, the back end is going to have a slight angle to it. That's not an absolute, but most of them are. And when you're looking at, say, an entry-level type gun, those are typically commercial size. That was done a long time ago. It's too long to go into here, but they both get the job done. A lot of people that buy these firearms don't realize they have a commercial receiver extension, and that's okay, because there's a lot of manufacturers that have stepped up to the plate to make stocks that will fit those. Having said that, you can tell easily if you have a couple of stocks laying around or access. If you have a mil-spec receiver extension, a commercial stock will go onto it, but it will be very loose. But a mil-spec stock will not go onto a commercial tube at all. I mean, you can't even force it on there. It's distinctly different. I usually tell people to stick with, if they have a choice, a mil-spec receiver extension, because their stock options are better.
Okay. So moving on, what's the next step in building our AR-15?
Right in line with that, you need to look at, of course, the internal components, but the grip itself, the standard A2 style grip, which is what basically it's like the cheap tires on the car to get it out onto the showroom. The A2 grip, it works. It's horribly uncomfortable. There are so many better choices. It's personal. I prefer Magpul and the Ergo and Tango Down grips, and it's very personal. But they all fit basically the same. They all attach with one screw through the bottom of that receiver. And it's very personal, and the best idea is just to fix some in your hand, feel some, and decide. Some of them have a tactile, grippy surface. Some of them do not. It just depends on what feels comfortable to you. The aftermarket grips, however, typically are a little bit bigger, so your hand is more comfortable. And if you stick with well-known brands, you're not going to go wrong. And it's just a personal, much like the buttstock, it's personal. You have to find one that works for you. That's not too heavy, not too light, and there's a million of them out there. The best thing to do is just look at a lot of them, see what's comfortable, and move forward from there.
Okay, so what we're talking about is the part that you grip with your hand when you hold on to the AR-15. If you're right-handed, you would grab it with that's the part you would hold with your right hand.
Correct.
Okay. Moving on from there, what's next?
Well, what's next is all the other parts that compose the lower receiver or action of the gun, and those are the small internal parts. There are what they call lower parts kits available that give you everything inclusive to finish out that lower receiver from the empty state. They work, but the thing is, a lot of those parts are so mass-produced, and they're sometimes a little rough, and they don't, and they will function. But there's a difference when you select each and every single one of those little components, whether it's the springs or the détentes that hold the takedown and the pivot pins. All those little things matter. So we typically cherry pick by manufacturer for each specific application those internal parts. The lower parts kits that you can purchase are anywhere between $75 and $140. But for the same money, you can hand select all those individual parts by manufacturer and have a much smoother, more reliable operating lower receiver or firearm at the end of the process. So I tell people, and the cost is there's no difference. But just knowing those parts, TTI is a manufacturer, Colt for some things, Armalite for certain things, JP, again, for some springs, K&S Precision for some springs, Superior Machine, Dewey Manufacturing. We use all of those for various applications, like the little détentes that hold those capture pins. Doesn't seem like much. The good ones are from K&S Precision. They're stainless steel, they're centerless ground, and they're perfect. They don't cost any more than an inexpensive one that's been just galvanized, if you will. But the difference in performance and the feel and the tactile feel of how fluid is that safety selector. You felt some guns that have really rough as a cob safety selector. The difference is that pin and that little détente that engage that selector might be rough. By sticking with let's say a K&S Precision, it becomes butter smooth. Your Colt, for example, probably has a very butter smooth safety selector. If you were to pick up a $600 or $700 DPMS sporting AR, you're going to find a huge difference in feel, and that's why. Those quality of components, those little things, it becomes greater than the sum of its total parts, if that makes sense.
Sure. Now, and how important is the trigger? I mean, that's part of this small internal parts group. How important is
critical. Most people, I don't know anybody in a shooting lifestyle that says, gosh, I wish this trigger was a lot heavier and grittier and just terrible. Everybody wants a much better trigger. And there are a lot of trigger systems out there. Some of them are very good. Some of them are suspect, in my opinion. At the end of the day, the only trigger I use is manufactured by a company called Geissele Automatics. They're located in Pennsylvania. And Bill Geissele has been making these triggers for several years. He's a high-power shooter, an excellent machinist. Everything they touch is solid gold. Those triggers, however, and he makes some incredibly high-end triggers for various applications. Most of these are what we consider combat triggers. And they are either single-stage, which is the standard type trigger, or they're two-stage, which is a different type of trigger, but it's still very safe and very effective. We use a lot of the Geissele two-stage triggers in ours, and we sell them, of course, and that's the only trigger I use. I have that much faith and confidence in it. A lot of police departments, military, it was originally developed for the military. A lot of police departments use the Geissele system because it is so safe and it is so precise. And when you feel one, it's incredible. So there are a lot of great other triggers out there for a tactile feel, for what some people want, a light, crisp trigger. There's some great ones out there. But at the end of the day, if you have to count on it day in and day out under the worst possible conditions, Geissele is it. That's the final word. He builds the finest trigger on the planet, hands down.
Jeff Holmes, would you contrast the difference for our class in comparing a single-stage trigger to a two-stage trigger? What is the actual difference? What is the feel? And why would someone want one over the other?
Well, a single-stage trigger is the original design. That single stage, what that means is as soon as you touch that trigger, you are pulling fully through the trigger mechanism under spring tension, both the trigger spring and the hammer spring. The sear engagement, which all firearms have, is what releases that trigger to go into battery and fire the firearm. You have to overcome a lot of force on a single-stage trigger. Typically, the spec is between 5.5 and 9 pounds for a military contract firearm. And that sounds like a lot, but sometimes it's not a lot of pull weight. But it can be very coarse and gritty if those surfaces are not trued precisely. They can be, but it has to be done very carefully because there's not a lot of material there to work with correctly. They always work. They're very safe. The two-stage trigger eliminates the interface between the actual hammer and the trigger itself. They don't touch. The only place they have contact is what's known as on the disconnector. So in essence, you have the perceived feel of less trigger weight pull, or less poundage, if you will. You still have the same trigger weight per se, but it's a perceived difference. That first stage is just merely you're taking up the slack on the trigger, and then as soon as you continue with your trigger squeeze, that engagement of the disconnectors here is going to release that trigger. So you've effectively cut the weight of that trigger pull in half, if that makes sense.
Oh, sure it does. And how does that affect accuracy? A two-stage trigger with someone who knows how to use it and is comfortable and has practice, as compared with a single-stage trigger. Do we have more accuracy with the two-stage trigger?
You have more inherent and potential accuracy simply because that two-stage trigger is going to break very crisply and very cleanly and exactly when you want it to. And what I mean by that is, as soon as you take the slack out of that trigger, any more pressure within a couple of pounds, 3 to 4 pounds, that trigger is going to release. If you don't want to take the shot, say the deer moved behind a tree and you let go, nothing has changed. You have no engagement. There's no sear engagement, so there's not a potential of a trigger half pulled and a hammer half falling. So for safety, that's why a lot of the military and law enforcement use them, because if they decide not to take a shot, they're not hanging there with a potentially serious issue where if they get bumped or they drop the firearm, it could go off. Not that that happens, but it could. With a two-stage, you'd never have that issue. That's why they're incredibly safe, and the tactile feel and perceived feel is so much better, allowing you to stay focused on your targets, your sight picture, your sight alignment, your breathing sequence, your trigger squeeze, and then your follow-through.
Okay, so if we are going to choose between a single stage and a two-stage as we build our AR-15, what is the difference in the cost between the single stage and the two-stage, typically?
Typically, the cost the difference is a quality single-stage trigger. And like I said, Geissele's are the ones I use for single and for two-stage. They start at $45 to $65 for the single stage, and they work wonderfully. They're very clean. Two-stage triggers go from about $200 and up.
Okay, so it's a significant difference in price between the single stage and the two-stage trigger for the AR-15. Jeff Holmes is with us, and we're going to talk in depth about building an AR-15. We still have the barrel to go through, barrel lengths, and there's a whole bunch more. We'll be back talking about building an AR-15. Jeff Holmes is with us, and we're building an AR-15, the modern musket. It's a great firearm that you can use to protect yourself and your family. I've got one in the studio, and I use it on the farm. Jeff, we've talked about the lower receiver. We've talked about the buffer tube, the trigger. What about the trigger guard? Is there something that we need to know about that?
You know, the standard trigger guard, was an attempt to give what's known as a winter trigger guard, and it works. There are so much better options out there today. Magpul Industries makes a phenomenal trigger guard. It gives you a larger opening, so if you have gloved hands or something like that, it's easier to access. They install exactly the same way. They are fixed. They do not move. They are not. They don't swing out of the way. I prefer those or another one made by a company called Seekins Precision. They actually just give you a little bit better manipulation of that trigger under adverse conditions. So I always use those. Several other makers. Troy makes one. All the high-end manufacturers make a replacement trigger guard. So we always just use them because I think they work better, and it's certainly an issue of function and form together, and they're aesthetically pleasing. So yeah, I encourage people to consider that. The standard A1, A2 configuration will get the job done, but to me, I don't want to have to fool with it. I just want to be able to put my finger into the trigger guard well and go to work.
Mm-hmm. Jeff, I'm looking at the AR-15 that I have, which is an SP1, and it's a shorty. And the trigger guard that I have is just a straight strip of metal with, and I'm looking at the cost of it. It's about $18, but the Magpul that you talked about is about half the price.
Either one, they have a polymer version, which is about $8, and they have a metal version, which is about $18. Either one of them work. We use them interchangeably, and it's a really subtle improvement that it's just you won't realize how nice it is until you actually have one. We can fix that for you, Vince. That's not a problem.
Okay, next time I see you, we'll do that. So what we've talked about the. Let's see, the buttstocks, the triggers, the trigger guards, the pistol grip, the parts kit. Are we on to the upper now?
Yeah, we can. Real quickly, there's some other parts that can be added to this lower, what I consider enhancement parts. I typically don't use those per se. We do offer them to our customers. Some of them use them. The reason I don't is, my philosophy, less is more, and simple always works, and overkill never fails. Having said that, adding some of these other enhancements requires a different level of skill sometimes, or a different manual of arms adaptation. And for the new user, I don't encourage them to start there because it can be too much going on at one time. I always tell people, learn the system as designed. You can always move up the food chain and the ladder of enhancements, but initially start with the simple. Simple is good. Simple doesn't confuse. Simple allows proper training and discipline, if that makes sense.
Sure. Jeff, so let's just name some of what those other enhancements that you might be talking about are.
Yeah, there's ambidextrous selectors or safeties. Some people need them, some people don't. I typically don't use them. If you're a left-handed shooter, they can be useful. The problem with them is sometimes if you're a right-handed shooter and you have one that's set up with it, that when you select that safety from safe to fire, it'll hit the web of your hand on your grip, and that can be a little disconcerting to some folks. The other thing is what's known as a battery-assisted device or a extended bolt release, which goes underneath and through the trigger guard, which allows you to use your actual trigger finger to engage your bolt from a locked position into a battery position. Again, it's one more part, and they do work, and they have a use, but for the average person, I don't typically recommend them unless they're willing to train to that level. And just remember, it's one more part that could get in the way.
Okay, Jeff Holmes is coming back for the second hour. Jeff, we're going to talk about the barrels and how to select a barrel and the upper receivers when we come back?
Sounds good.
Sounds good. Okay, Jeff Holmes, Vin Finelli, USAPrepares.com. We're building the other half of the AR-15. Barrels, very important. And we're going to have a discussion on how to select the barrel length, the twist, and what you need to know about the different types of barrels for your AR-15. We'll be right back after top of the hour news and a couple commercials. This is USAPrepares.com.
Is your call to action. Get prepared, America. Economy, survival, energy, disasters. This is USAPrepares.com. Informative radio, educational radio. Interact now by emailing instructor@USAPrepares.com or text at 434-390-7953. Class, please take your seats. Now, your instructor, Vincent Finelli.
Everyone all set for hour number 2? This is USAPrepares.com. Cocked, locked. Jeff Holmes is with us, and you can contact Jeff Holmes at his email address, MOA1911 at live.com, MOA1911 at live.com. During the first hour, we built the lower receiver of our AR-15 rifle, and for this hour, we're going to build the upper receiver. That contains the barrel, and there's a lot of choices in barrel selection: threaded barrels, crown barrels, barrel length, barrel hardness, rate of twist. There's so many choices we have. Jeff Holmes, let's talk about the upper receiver. Where would you like to start there?
Let's go ahead and start with the barrels. There's a lot of options and choices out there, and again, it all boils down to what we kind of tell people: you have to define what your need is, the old military acronym of MENS, Mission Essential Needs Statement, which whatever you're going to use it for, that will define what your material should be. And the other thing is, some people see the term SOP mod, which is Special Operations Peculiar Modification, meaning we're going to start with something basic and then turn it into something that more meets our Mission Essential Needs Statement. And that's the beauty of the system. It's so adaptable. Sometimes it's too adaptable, believe it or not, and I think we've all seen examples of that. But the barrels themselves, the original barrel was 20 inches long. It actually had a 1 9-inch twist rate, and it was a lightweight, or pencil barrel as it's called. I think your example actually is like that. Today,
that's what I have.
Yeah, and believe it or not, those guns will shoot and shoot and shoot accurately, surprisingly accurately. Most people don't realize how good they actually are. Excuse me. The barrel twist rates today that are most prevalent are 1 7 inches of twist, 1 8 inches, and 1 9. Typically on your economy ARs, you're going to find a 1 9-inch twist rate. If you are only shooting 55 to maybe 62 or 60 grain bullet weights, that's fine. But if you're going to add any kind of heavier bullet weight or other options of bullets, you're really need to look at that 1 7 or the 1 8-inch twist. It's very similar to in archery. For those of us who shoot traditional archery, and I do, I have a handmade mulberry longbow that a friend of mine made, came off of a tree in his grandfather's farm here in Missouri, but I actually have to have the arrow shafts I use, which are all cedar out of Oregon. These arrows have to be matched in weight, what's known as a spine weight, to the bow draw and length and pull weight. Bullets are the same way. They have to be matched to that twist rate to be most effective and give you the most accuracy. For our use, we typically stay with the 1 7-inch twist because it gives you the best of everything. It will still shoot the 55-grain bullet just fine, but it really will optimize the heavier weight bullet, and that's originally why they went to that 1 7 some years ago, back in the 80s, to take advantage of the new bullet configurations the military was using. Barrel lengths anywhere from 7 inches all the way on up to 24, but for our discussion, we stick with the 16-inch for a carbine length firearm, which is the most useful. The 14.5-inch barrel was originally designed as a short, compact barrel length that was the shortest they could make it and still deliver absolute and utter reliability and still meet the specification of the accuracy that Aberdeen had decided that they needed, or the proving grounds, the accuracy components. A 14.5-inch barrel gains you nothing. You are kind of stuck with, at that point, if you have a 14.5-inch barrel that does not have a permanently affixed muzzle device, you then have what's known as an NFA item, National Firearms Act. Nothing wrong with that. You're just going to pay a $200 tax to do that. Or you're going to have a muzzle attachment permanently affixed. Some of them come that way. The 16-inch barrel, at the end of the day, does it all, and it does it well, and that's what we stick with. Along with that, the various contours. There's a lightweight, as we discussed. There's heavyweight. There's a couple in between called government or medium profile, and then there's the M204, which is the one you see a lot of times that has that extra cut. Halfway between the front sight and the end of the muzzle, there's a cut there that's radius, and that's actually for attachment of a grenade launcher. Most people aren't going to have one of those, so to me it's a non-issue. Whether it has that or not is irrelevant as long as the barrel is quality. What's quality? Quality today is a hammer-forged barrel. There are other great barrels out there, and the reason hammer forging is so good is it creates a very, very precise barrel, whereas there's almost no imperfections in that barrel because it's literally hammered around a mandrel. Chrome lining. Chrome lining was originally put in these barrels to sustain full auto fire and not chew up the rifling. It's not a deal breaker today. Chrome lining, if done correctly, is fine, and it will allow you to have 20 to 30,000 rounds of accurate service life out of a barrel. The new process is what's known as melaniting or salt nitride bathing. What that does, it actually creates a molecular bond into the steel. It's actually harder than chrome, so it gives you all the benefits of a traditionally cut and broached rifled barrel with none of the defects or deficits possibly from an improper chrome job. We typically use Daniel Defense barrels in most of ours. We also use some from a company called Noveski and another from Seekins for various applications, and some Lothar Walther barrels. There are stainless, and there's chrome lined, there's hammer forged, and there's melanited. They all have a place. The difference is these barrels typically start at $350 as opposed to the $150 low-end or entry-level barrel. You'll get about 6,000 rounds of service life out of one of those entry-level barrels. These barrels, you'll never wear them out. Again, the 16-inch barrel is probably the best overall, does everything that everyone needs, and still gives you compactability in the envelope. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Now, as we talk about this, we talk about the barrel life, we talk about the different materials that barrels are made of, and we talked about the twist. Just as a side question, is the first shot of a brand new barrel as accurate as after a break-in, and what is the break-in period?
Well, typically, depending on barrel manufacturer, sometimes that first shot can be, and then again, you get into some very esoteric barrels that are very specialized. For the most part, a barrel kind of does need to be broken in. It needs to set through some heating and expansion and contraction, find its harmonic balance, and some other things. So after about 300 to 500 rounds, that's pretty much the consistency of where it's going to shoot throughout the rest of its service life. We always tell people, run them hot, run them hard, and make sure that they're kind of seated in all those parts, kind of like seating an old piston rings in an engine. Once everything kind of gets itself together and everybody's shaking hands inside the system, why they all agree on what the outcome should be, and then Next thing is downrange, your accuracy becomes much more consistent. So about 500 rounds is a good ballpark rule of thumb break-in.
Okay, and then there's another barrel type. The Olympic Arms has I believe it's called the chrome alloy. That's their terminology for it. It's like a chrome alloy. Is that as good? Should we stay away from it, or is it okay?
That'd be one I'd stay away. What they're really saying is it's a standard chrome moly steel, which all these barrels are typically made of, unless they're stainless. Usually a 4000 series alloy, and that's a fine material if it's been heat treated properly and manufactured properly. Those barrels will perform, although today most of these barrels from a quality manufacturer are being melanited on the inside and the outside, and that runs about an 80 Rockwell hardness. Chrome lining runs about 55 to 60 maybe, and non-lined or non-melanited barrels are somewhere in that 30 to 40 hardness level. So you can definitely see a difference. Olympic barrels, I tend to shy away from myself, as well as like DSA and a couple others. And I just have to say, if anyone's listening, I either haven't mentioned their favorite component or manufacturer, I apologize. And if I have said something that maybe you took an offense to because I kind of discounted a manufacturer, I apologize. But we know what works, and we know why it works, and that's what we kind of subscribe to, if that makes sense.
Sure. And class, let me let you know that coming to the next expo, it's going to be in depth, and Jeff's going to be with us. Jeff Holmes is going to be with us, and we're going to build an AR-15 right then and there. So that's the plans for the next one. So if you're interested in pursuing this at an in-depth level at the next expo, there'll be a seminar on building an AR-15 from the ground up. And you can actually put the parts in your hand and build it as part of Jeff's seminar. Jeff, you talked about the twist rate, and I'd like to go back to that for just a minute, because 1 in 9, 1 in 8, 1 in 7, what that really means is that the projectile, the bullet, is going to do a 360-degree spin in 9 inches, 8 inches, or 7 inches. So a 1 in 7 twist rate actually means that the bullet is going to spin faster, right?
Correct.
Than in a 1 in 9. And what does that mean for accuracy, Jeff?
Well, depending again on the bullet weight, sometimes these heavier bullets up to the 77 grain, they need that stabilization that faster twist rate gives them, so that they can maintain their flight path accurately. And I may go a little above it here, but what happens is you have two different levels of speed, and it's called subsonic and supersonic. And in between that is known as a transonic, and that's where the bullet's leveling out before it shifts gears, if you will. That faster twist rate allows that transonic speed to be much more consistent, allowing you much more accuracy at range. When we talk about range, we typically talk out to 500 yards with this particular bullet. So if it's the rifleman's quarter mile. If you can see it, more than likely you can hit it with proper bullet selection and proper barrel matching, if that's on target there.
Mm-hmm. And Jeff, the military surplus ammo that I remember purchasing many, many years ago for the AR-15 was 55 grain. Is that still the standard?
Well, actually, for the military, it's a 62 grain, and NATO uses a 62 grain. The 55 grain is still used in a lot of theaters, and it's still a military round, because there are some older guns in service out there that have the 1 in 9 rate, and it still works. And typically out to 300 yards, let's say, most people cannot outshoot the difference between the two bullet weights or the two twist rates. Simply can't be done by most shooters.
Okay. We're going to talk more about barrels when we come back on the other side of this break. We talked about the twist rate, 1 in 9, 1 in 8, 1 in 7, 55 grain, 62 grain. And we're going to talk more about barrel length, crown barrels, threaded barrels, and the upper receiver, the AR-15. With USA Prepares Senior Instructor Jeff Holmes. We're building the modern musket. We'll be right back. On Monday, Ziggy's meetup on Monday. There is a meetup on Monday, Ziggy's, Springfield, Missouri, and 5:30. We're going to be talking about reloading ammunition, rifle, pistol, shotgun. We're going to show a video. We're going to have the components right there. We're going to talk about the do's, the don'ts, the dangers, the safety that's involved, that you need to have involved. We're going to talk about the cost for the equipment, the cost for the components, and the savings that you can see from reloading your own ammunition. Jeff Holmes is with us, and we're talking about the AR-15, the modern musket. We've talked about some of the components of barrels and what to look for in terms of hardness, in terms of twist rate, in terms of length. Jeff, what about crowned barrels versus threaded barrels? Can you tell us what that really means and what we should look for?
Well, all these barrels are going to have a crown to them. Whether or not they have threads at the end for a muzzle device is the difference. And typically, the unthreaded or unmuzzle device barrels are typically your target type or bench rest type barrels. We do a little bit with those, but primarily we focus on what are the combat effective rifles, and those will always have a muzzle device. And since we kind of went right into that, there's flash hiders and there's compensators. We are a big fan of compensators, and the reason being is, at least for our shooting lifestyle, it allows the recoil mitigation to be less, so that you can effectively put more rounds into the target quicker, with faster recovery and a lot less recoil impulse. Even though the cartridge itself doesn't have a lot of recoil, that little bit of extra help at the end makes a huge difference. We use battle comps, spikes, Dynacomps, and BCM, Bravo Company Manufacturing compensators. We also use another one. It's kind of a hybrid made by a company called Viltor, and I've mentioned them before. It's VLTOR. If you look at their website, you'll see them. The Viltor style A2 flash hider is a hybrid. Most people don't realize it. From outward appearances, you can't tell it's any different than the standard AR-15 birdcage style flash hider. Internally, however, it's very different, so it offers the best of both worlds. Standard flash hider is going to run you about $12. A Viltor is going to run you $50. There's a reason, again, for that. The compensators are anywhere from $100 to $150. Yeah, it's expensive, but what it gives you as far as performance is simply unmatched in any other system. But all these barrels are going to have a crown to them at some point. You can fire a threaded end barrel without a flash attachment, or muzzle attachment rather, and it's going to shoot just as well, accurate-wise.
Jeff, I'm looking at the AR-15 that I have right next to me, and it's got the bird cage. And when you fire it at night, there's a muzzle blast that you can see coming out in many different directions around 360 degrees around the barrel. So you're talking about a compensator that will reduce the perceived recoil, but also does that hold the muzzle end from going vertical as more? Is that the purpose?
Yes, it does. And you mentioned a flash hider, and the A2 is somewhat effective. It works. There's a couple of better ones out there. One's made by a company called Smith Enterprises. They make one called the Vortex. There is virtually zero flash. You can barely, there is none. So if muzzle flash is a problem and you need to solve that for the money, I suggest a Smith Vortex flash hider. They work perfectly. I want to sidetrack 1 second real quick. I don't know if you got this email, but I did. I think you did. Michael, I think, is listening, and I'm going to answer this real quickly, and then we'll move on. 300 Blackout, 300 Whisper. Yes, Mike, same thing. The Blackout is actually SAMI approved, which is Sporting Arms and Ammunition. It was just basically renamed and given a blessing so that all the ammunition manufacturers would get on board. The cartridge has been around for about 40 years, believe it or not. So today, typically, it's a 300 Blackout. It will give you a 30 caliber envelope on your system. As far as ammo, if you can get it, the very finest out there, whether it's subsonic or supersonic, is made by a company called Barnes. It's called their Barnes TAC TX. Very finest ammo for this system, hands down. Good luck finding it right now. It's in short supply, but anybody's 300 Blackout will work. So if that answers that, it saves me some typing, and we can keep going on. So if not, I'll answer that in an email. So.
Just looking at the news during the break, and U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder wrote a letter to Russia saying that we will not torture or seek the death penalty for Edward Snowden? I thought he was a hero. Why would we torture or seek the death penalty for a hero? It makes no sense. It makes no sense. I thought Edward Snowden was a hero. Jeff Holmes is with us. You can contact him at moa1911@live.com, and you can ask him your questions. He will be at at our events, the Get Prepared Expo. He's on the air with us a lot. We're talking about barrels. And, Jeff, you got a question about blackout. Can you explain what blackout really means?
Yeah, real simply, the cartridge was originally developed, was known as a 300 Whisper. It's the 5.56 or 223 round that's been necked up to 30 caliber. So you have now a 30 caliber rifle on top of your AR because it's modular. It uses the same bolt group, the same magazines, everything, but it gives you a 30 caliber projectile. The Whisper, like I said, was the old name. The Blackout is the new name because it was granted acceptance by the sporting arms and ammunition manufacturers industry. Once they do that and they give a Wildcat cartridge their blessing, all the manufacturers will jump on board because they've now got a standard by which to manufacture to. So the two are interchangeable. You'll see a lot of ammo that says 300 Whisper. Remington does it, and then there's standard 300 Blackout. Slight differences in powders. Typically, they run pistol powders, and the bullet weights can vary. But at the end of the day, they're both going to work just fine. More than likely, today's barrels are all going to be 300 Blackout marked. That's the normal.
Okay. Now, we've talked about the barrels. You want to talk about the other components of the upper receiver?
Yeah, the upper receiver itself. There's the old configuration, the A1 style, which is the fixed carrying handle. There's the A2 style, which has a different rear sight on it in the fixed carrying handle. Then there's the A3 or the flat top, which has a removable carry handle sight. For today's shooter, the A3 flat top configuration gives you all the advantages. It used to be if you wanted to put a scope on one of these, you had to cut the carrying handle off and get creative. We don't have to do that anymore. The A3 works perfectly. You can put all kinds of different optics and attachments on there. It's beautiful. One of the best design changes ever. Most of those upper receivers, again, from a quality manufacturer, are all going to be made out of the proper alloy and properly made, so that rail is very consistent on top for the attachment of your optic or your scope rings or whatever you're going to put on there, backup sights, any of that. We use a lot of those personally. I just think they work the best for the value that you're going to pay for. Upper receivers are typically inexpensive. Again, from a quality manufacturer, they're all going to work, and that's the simplest way for most folks to start out because it gives them so many different variables. If they want to move into magnified optics, or if they don't want to do that, they can always use a carry handle rear sight, and it's very classic.
Mm-hmm.
The
Jeff,
other thing,
may I ask at this point, what do you use? What is your favorite all-purpose AR-15? What is the configuration that you have?
Mine is, and I think you probably saw it at the last expo I attended. It's pretty basic. It's pretty simple. It's a standard AR-15 telescopic stock on it with a Magpul CTR stock. I have a 16-inch medium weight, medium contour government profile barrel, which is a little bit heavier than a pencil barrel and a little bit heavier than the SOCOM M4 barrel. My barrel is actually made by a company called Green Mountain. I also have, I know you don't use them, but I do have a quad rail on mine that's been covered with rail attachment. Mm-hmm. Mine's very simple. As you saw mine too, I spray paint mine with Krylon. I don't Cerakote or Duracoat. Krylon's cheap, it's effective, and I can change it with the surroundings and seasons. It's a workhorse. It's a tool. I have an optic on it. It has a front sight post on it. The standard A2 triangular sight post is on there. That's mine, and a sling, a very simple sling. I practice what I preach. Less is more. It's very simple, very basic, very old school in some regards. But it gets the job done, and it's rugged and reliable. That's my personal. That's my one I grab all the time. I have others, of course, for various purposes, but that's the one I always grab. It's simple, it's basic, and it has never failed me. Again, looking at it from the outside, it's an old beat-up Chevy Impala. The difference is underneath the hood, it's got a Corvette engine. That's where we keep going back to the small parts matter, the quality matters, and those little things become greater than the sum of their total parts, so that efficiency and effectiveness are always on par.
How would you contrast that to my SP1? It's not all that different, is it?
No, yours is very simple with really none of the other upgrades that maybe I've done in mine, being a quad rail on it, because I do have a use. Not everyone does, but I do. And the stock itself is a little different than yours, and that's a personal thing for comfortability and user access. Those things can easily be upgraded, changed, or reverted back. That's the difference. Side by side, there's a lot of identical things there, because they're very basic and very simple, and they're always going to work.
Okay. So do we complete the discussion with gas blocks and bolt carrier groups, or do we go on to...
No, that's pretty much. And let me touch on that real quickly. We tend to favor what's known as a full auto carrier. Those are perfectly legal. They're not considered a machine gun part. The reason we use those is because they're heavier. And the nice thing about heavy is it slows everything down inside the reciprocating parts, i.e. the bolt, because the hard part of extraction is on that bolt head. And if you can slow that carrier down and slow down the reciprocation, it's just softer and gentler cycling and easier on those components, which gives them more durability. It's known as dwell time in the bolt, and because there's a timing that goes on in there after the round is fired and it starts its extraction and ejection process. We typically use the mid-length gas system because of that. Again, it's a little slower, a little smoother, and it uses all standard parts without having any issues of reliability. The bolt itself is the critical component. The carrier is really not. As long as it's the carrier key, which is what takes the gas from the tube, as long as that's correctly staked and sealed, you're fine. They can come loose, but if it's done correctly the first time, they probably never will. The carrier itself never wears out, but the bolts possibly can. Bolts do break. It's not often, but they can, and from a quality manufacturer, they typically won't. You'll see a lot of bolts that have a stamp on them or a writing that says MPI. That stands for Magnetic Particle Inspection, also known as magnafluxing. All that tells you is that the surface has no imperfections. It doesn't tell you if the core of the material is correct. Heat treating is key, and you'll never know. But if you buy from a quality manufacturer, you know that the bolt has passed certain tests. Now, everybody can have a bad day. Colt can have a bad day. Armalite can have a bad day. And those manufacturers will always stand behind that product. So the heat treating of that bolt is much more critical. There are some newer alloys out there. The 9000 series alloy steels for the bolts seems to be working out really well. I think that's probably the next generation. You'll see references to Carpenter 158 bolt material steel. All that is a name brand. It's really P6 mold steel. It takes a heat treat a certain way so that it offers full auto reliability for the service life of the firearm. Again, a quality manufacturer is going to give you a quality part. And there are some components that can wear. That's normal. But a quality manufacturer, you're going to have less chance of those small issues popping up.
Jeff, if I wanted to convert an AR-15 lower receiver to be a .22 long rifle, could I buy a barrel for that? And what else would I need?
You could buy a barrel. You can buy a whole top end, as we call it, which is the .22 caliber barrel on an upper receiver that just simply, with two pins, you remove off of your lower. This goes right on top. At that time, you would have a bolt that you would replace that handles the .22 long rifle cartridge and the magazine, and that's it. You can also use your standard barrel with just that conversion kit. The accuracy isn't quite as good as the dedicated .22 barrel, but for general training purposes or acclimation or teaching, it's perfect. But if you want all the accuracy, you kind of look at a dedicated .22 upper, and then it will give you all the accuracy that your standard Ruger 10/22 or Winchester .22 is going to give you. For training purposes or plinking, the drop-in conversion for .22 long rifle is great. We use those a lot. We do sell those, but we use them ourselves personally. Even though .22s are expensive, they're still a lot cheaper than 60 cents a round for centerfire ammo. And out to 50 yards, they'll get the job done. You're not going to be taking headshots at squirrels, but you're going to get close.
Okay, and I have one. As a matter of fact, everyone in the family has one of those conversions kits for an AR-15, and they work great. They really do. And for plinking, it's just fine, as you said. So, Jeff, what would it cost us for a barrel if we wanted a, let's say, good quality barrel, not the highest quality, but something that we'd be satisfied with buying one of for a lifetime purchase, 16 inches? What would that cost roughly for a 223-556?
The barrel itself, you're looking at just around $300 for a quality manufactured barrel, somewhere in that $250 to $300, but typically closer to the $300. The upper receiver at about another $115. At that point, you've got a fully functioning part that will drop on. The bolt group is going to cost another between $120 and $200, depending on manufacturer. At that point, you're probably looking at the $580, $550 range for a drop-on, ready to go. Put it on your lower and put a magazine and start shooting.
Okay, and then what would it cost for that a good quality 22 long rifle complete upper?
Those are just under $400, and that comes complete with basically the conversion unit, the bolt, and a charging handle designed that's solid, that doesn't have an opening in it, so that you get loose spent brass in there, which can sometimes cause a problem. But about between $385 and $400 is typically what they run.
So, Jeff, let me see if I've got this right. My SP1 for less than $400, I can have a complete upper and I can put a scope on it, ready to go.
For a 22, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. There you have it. And what would the cost be for just the conversion bolt assembly to convert my SP1 or anyone else's AR-15 to 22 long rifle? What would that cost?
Anywhere between $185 and $225, depending on configuration and material.
Okay, so for twice the price, you can have a complete 22 upper with the barrel. Jeff Holmes is with us, and we're going to give you his contact information when we come back. Jeff Holmes, Senior USAPreparedness.com instructor. I'm thinking about the next Get Prepared Expo. And Jeff, when you and I were in Springfield, Missouri, and you gave the class on concealed weapons and how to get your, qualify for the paperwork to get your concealed weapons permit here in Missouri, it was an 8-hour class. It was over 4 hours in the classroom, and then we all went to the range and qualified. I'm thinking about the expo. Jeff, I think what we're doing right here is a full-day class, with hands-on, actually seeing, feeling, touching the parts, passing them around. Is this not a full-day class on building an AR-15?
It probably is a little bit, yeah. It's probably closer to that than it is an hour and a half. It's a little more to it that meets the eye. I think you can kind of get right.
And we won't have commercials, and we won't have top of the hour news.
That's true.
But what we will do is we'll have a break here and there. So I'm thinking that we ought to consider a full day class as part of the expo. So Jeff, to get in touch with you, MOA 1911 at live.com. MOA 1911 at live.com. And there's a link on page 1 on the website. So if you'd like to contact Jeff Holmes, that's his email address, MOA 1911 at live.com. CCW training, if you'd like AR-15 parts, accessories, the full AR-15. And we didn't get to suppressors, and maybe that's something we should talk about in another class. But because we haven't talked about sights yet, have we?
No, we haven't got there. We may not make it. There's a lot to cover in 2 hours.
Well, let me ask you this, really quickly. If we wanted to convert our AR-15 lower to a 308 and get a complete 308 upper, is that possible?
Not with that system. They're 2 entirely different systems. The components are much larger for the 308, so it's a whole separate animal.
Okay, so if we wanted the 9mm and the 308, is that a different system?
No, the 9mm, there's conversions to use your standard AR-15 lower, and then you just get a top-end barrel assembly. Okay,
so what with the AR-15 lower? What will that convert to? What calibers?
Well, of course it'll go to the the 9mm with a conversion. It will also do 300 blackout, 300 whisper. It will do 6.5 Creedmoor. It will do 6.8 SPC2. Also 204 Ruger. There's a couple other Wildcats out there, but otherwise, that's the 6.8 is kind of one of my favorites. A lot of guys love them, and it's a love-hate thing, but I love it. It's almost like a 270 Winchester with a little bit more long distance added in. So it's one of my very favorites, actually.
Okay. In the 3 minutes we have remaining, let's talk quickly about sights. What do you suggest we consider?
Sights are one of those things that if you stick with the quality, I like Troy's and GG&G. Magpul makes a good serviceable polymer sight. Do not use it on a railed gas block. It will melt. But I use GG&Gs because they're old school, and I'm old school, but the Troy's we use a lot. We sell a lot of them, and it's a high-end quality product. Learning to run iron sights is critical because optics, although they don't fail today, they can. So learning how to use that system with iron sights is probably the first place to start. And anybody's quality optics or iron sights are going to get the job done with reliability and consistency, and that's key.
Jeff, when you shoot, do you shoot one eye open or two?
I use both eyes.
Okay, and that's kind of important, class. So keep that in mind. Try to keep both eyes open. And during the break, I just picked up the AR and sighted it with my iron sights. I don't have a scope on it, and works fine for me. Just iron sights works fine. And I remember being able to easily hit an 8-inch target at 200 yards. Iron sights. So it can be done easily. And I'm not young. I mean, I'm 60. Okay, so Jeff, optics. What do you like in optics? Just let's talk about magnification versus no magnification, and scope versus. Jeez. Jeff? Did you hit the button?
I did not. It's been Alex.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Alex hit the button. Wow, did time go? Jeez. Jeff, I guess. Well, we're going to have to do it again. So next time we'll talk about sights. We'll talk about the different kinds of sights. Red dots, green dots, laser. And we'll talk about suppressors. How about that?
Sounds good.
Okay. Jeff Holmes, MOA 1911 at live.com. I'm Vin Finelli, USAPrepares.com. Class, above all, honesty and integrity. What happens next is up to you.